Dr. Nolan Cabrera is going to be speaking today about the myth of critical race theory in public education. A lot of folks throw this expression around. They don't really understand what they're talking about, but I think we're really lucky to have a good presenter today. He's a nationally recognized expert in the areas of racism, anti-racism, whiteness, ethnic studies. He is currently a professor at the Center of the Study of Higher Education at University of Arizona. It was the only academic featured in the MTV documentary, White People. He is the author of the award-winning book, White Guys on Campus, and he was an expert witness in the Tucson Unified School District's Mexican-American Studies case, Gonzalez versus Douglas, the highest profile ethnic studies case in the country's history. He has given hundreds of lectures, keynote addresses, and trainings throughout the country. So, Dr. Cabrera, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for inviting me into your space. And I really, I loved how messy democracy was and how beautifully y'all handled that. So I love being that little fly on the wall. So today I was asked to talk for roughly 20 minutes or so, just about critical race theory. We hear it all the time. It's the boogeyman. And now I'm going to focus most of my attention on why there is a controversy. We will have time at the end for a little bit of a Q&A, and I will provide a brief overview of what critical race theory is, but not a lot of depth. And I don't really know how to balance all this out. So I'm going to try to focus more on why there is a controversy in the first place, and then we can kind of backfill a lot of this in. So the first point that I'm going to make is, bluntly put, there is no controversy. This is a manufactured crisis. This is right out of the right-wing playbook, taking something that's very misunderstood, putting something scary around it, and making folks afraid of it. Basically, it's sort of that straw person argument where people don't necessarily know what critical race theory is. It sounds scary. It sounds subversive. It sounds in this way. And then they fill in, well, look, it really means hating white people and anti-American and hating America and all these different things. And I start from that because if I don't start from that it's a manufactured crisis, we start buying into that playbook. We start buying into the ways that there's just massive misinformation in this post-truth era. And as an academic, I have to value truth very keenly. And part of that isn't just identifying what is truthful, but also exposing lies in the process. And this is a lie of massive proportion. Because the whole idea right now is that you had critical race theory that was it really started in law in the late 70s, early 80s. And if you remember back to this period of time, it was very common to only think of racism as an individual issue. We're sort of like, that person is totally racist and they're a bad person. This person is a totally good person and they're not racist, and seeing it as sort of an attitude as opposed to a structural reality of society. And unfortunately, you started getting people who were really dissatisfied with that and saying, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't really, these hyper individualistic notions can't account for why we have persistent racial inequities. And that is that, in many respects, a lot of the, let's say, de jure segregation that ended after Brown versus the Board of Education still exists in de facto ways 30, 40, 50 years later. How do we start explaining this? Because is it just that there are evil racist people who are really good at hiding their racism? Or is this more of a structural issue that we're dealing with? Now, folks sometimes get a little confused or maybe want a little clarity when I talk about an individual versus a structural issue. So I offer a simple kind of SAT analogy in this situation where I'm wearing a $20 hoodie right now. I would not necessarily be considered a capitalist by any stretch of the imagination. However, anytime that I go and fill up my gas tank at the Circle K, I am participating in a system of capitalism. And that's kind of the point, is that each one of us has the ability to participate in a system of racism without necessarily being an overt racist in the place. And what's interesting is that with critical race theory, folks have had to grapple with the idea that even within individual people, you have racism and anti-racism frequently embedded within the same body. And so a lot of critical race theory started taking race on a more structural level and really trying to apply it in law. There was a very foundational work that came out of Derek Bell, Harvard professor, the first Black tenured professor at Harvard Law School. And he one of the foundational pieces he did was reinterpret Brown versus the Board of Education, because a lot of times the mythology around Brown is that it was this, um, you know, the country is turning, we start really caring about Black children. And really what he found in his work was, no, really the determining factor of Brown was more about the harm that segregation caused to white kids, as opposed to the harm that was already existing against Black children. And so he created a concept called interest convergence theory. And in his theorizing, the advancement of Black people would only be tolerated to the extent that it also benefited white people in the process. We saw the same thing happen in arguments around affirmative action. That is, that we were never able to use affirmative action now that even though it's been displaced now, or been eliminated now by the Supreme Court. We haven't been able to we weren't able to say, because of the history and contemporary manifestations of racism, we can consider race in college admissions. It was always this thing called the diversity rationale, where having inclusive and diverse learning environments increases the learning for all people, white people included. And that was what the Supreme Court would hear as a compelling educational interest. Again, the interests of minoritized folk had to converge with those of white folk. And it wasn't like this radical social transformation that you hear about affirmative action nowadays. Back in the mid 90s, folks in education were equally uh, uh, sort of dissatisfied with these individualized notions of what constitutes race and racism. And so, two founding folks, Gloria Ladson Billings and Bill Tate, used the ideas in critical race theory and law and brought them over to education. And in many respects, that's really where critical race theory has been manifest in the most important ways in colleges of law and colleges of education. Now, it's not what's funny listening to the public discourse is that you hear critical race theory is everywhere, it's everywhere, it's everywhere. I've taught in a college of education at the U of A, and I lecture colleges of education throughout the country. This is not a it's an area of study, and it's not really the dominant factor in schools of education that folks are making it out to be. And you can already see that trying to talk about something as complicated as interest convergence theory, this is not something that's being manifest in K-12 learning environments in any way, shape, or form. It's almost laughable to think, like, you hear this, well, my kindergartner was learning critical race theory. No, they weren't. Just no, they simply were not. And then folks will say, well, the kindergarten teacher was critical race theory informed. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But the critical race theory is not nearly as widespread or as dominant as the right wing would have you believe. And so, as a consequence of that, really what happened is you had sort of this 20, 30-year established area of academia. It's not really a discipline, it's not really a theory. It kind of fits in this weird space where a lot of scholars would come together to try to make sense out of race and law and race and education, and really trying to move it beyond sort of this individualized notion of how we do race. And what's been interesting in these situations is that now it's become a catch-all phrase for everything, to white privilege, white fragility, DEI efforts, and all these things. And again, it's a very callous way of saying the mass public does not know what critical race theory is. We're going to create it as an umbrella term and then just plug anything we dislike into it in those ways. One of the things that does concern me, though, is that I've been as I continue to talk about this, folks who are a little, say, more left of center, but not leftist in my social circles have been, um, understand the misinformation that comes out of right wing politics right now, again, in a post truth society. But what's interesting is they start to buy into these myths of the woke academy and seeing how, DEI is taking over everything and anti-racism and they start to buy into this discourse, even though it's part of the exact same playbook that denies a woman's right to choose, that denies the existence of climate change, like all of the different ways that there have been attacks on our fundamental rights over the last several years. It's all part of the same playbook, but for some reason there's something very disconcerting to a lot of people in my social circles who are just slightly left of center when we start meaningfully engaging issues of race. I know that folks really started to engage a little bit more deeply post the murder of George Floyd, but a lot of that momentum has shifted, has changed after the fact. And so, I struggle with that. And one of the things that's interesting is I hear a lot of people latch on to different narratives about, like, well, I heard about this one lesson plan that did X. This one lesson, this teacher in Southern California who was teaching their students to, uh, you know, to had their white students feel guilty about being white or something to that effect. And and say, well, shouldn't we really be uprooting that in education? Is that really appropriate? And I always have two responses to that. And I'm sorry that I'm kind of having a verbal debate in my head with you right now. It's a little hard to do this on Zoom. I prefer these in person, but thank you for humoring me in that. And so I don't condone educational malpractice in any way. And if people are hurting our kids, there should be mechanisms to address them. But I always have a tendency to think critically, first of all, about the accuracy of the story, because, and remember, we've been down this road before here in Arizona. Tom Horn did the exact same thing with Mexican American studies. No one knew what it was. He filled it in as anti-American, anti-Western, and white hating, and people bought it in mass. Now he's again the state superintendent of public instruction. Um, and a lot of this playbook relied on anonymous people saying, hey, this is how Mexican American studies hurt me, and now we're doing virtually the same thing, but this is how critical race theory has hurt me. And so the very first thing is always check your sources. Who is putting this out here? Is it, do they have a political axe to grind, and accurate, and ask really what happened on a day-to-day level. But the second point is that there are people who misapply every kind of educational approach, and critical race theory is not unique in that respect. I have people who I've seen. I've talked to students who've had teachers who tell them that, you know um, the when Manifest Destiny was happening, it was really largely barren land out here, very uncivilized, and the white folk who came out largely civilized the West and conquered it, and that's why we are in this position where we are today, which is in horribly disrespectful to the Mexican and indigenous peoples who were living here at that particular point in time. And again, I'm not going to condemn the entire educational field. Instead, I'm going to say this is an inappropriate way of teaching this work. And there are individual ways of holding people accountable without having to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And unfortunately, right now, this is an all-out attack. That it's not just about critical race theory, but this is an all-out attack on public education as a whole. Because don't get it twisted, it's very much related to trying to expand issues of vouchers, issues of school choice, which really fundamentally don't do anything to actually improve student achievement on the whole. Really, what they do is they resegregate our schools. And so this is part of a larger right-wing attack on public education, where for the last 40 years, they've been seen as bastions of indoctrination. You're indoctrinating our kids into these leftist ideals. And really, I have two retorts to that. The first is that, number one, I've been teaching at the university for about 15 years now. I can barely get my students to accurately go through the entire syllabus. let alone read all of the stuff that's there. So if I'm indoctrinating them, I've got to be like the most master teacher in the world. And I say that with a little kind of a little glimmer in my eye, because the point is that indoctrination is an analysis of the interaction between a student and a teacher and how that is how that proceeds. You can't just take a curriculum, you can't just take a reading and say you're indoctrinating someone by presenting this. By that definition, in the last class that I taught at the U, I taught Rush Limbaugh and Ben Shapiro and Christina Hoff Sommers. And I mean, go down the. I've had all those folks on my syllabus, and yet they would never accuse me of indoctrination to right wing ideas. The idea is that it's a pedagogy. There's curriculum and there's pedagogy. There's what you teach and how you teach it. And unfortunately, none of these have ever really addressed how the teaching is being done. It's really just about, oh, here's critical race theory. It's the boogeyman. It's scary. And at the same time, it's really troubling that because our public school teachers are constantly under attack, and we also know that they're underfunded, that they are paid horribly for the amount of expertise that they have to bring to the classroom. And these kind of attacks, we have to remember they have material consequences on our students. When your teacher is so scared that they could be surveilled, that they could be fired for mentioning something that's race forward under the guise of you can't talk about critical race theory. And keep in mind, there are teachers in TUSD who are explicitly told, do not mention critical race theory right now. It's too politically contentious. And that for me is really, really troubling, because we're hemorrhaging teachers right now. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it not only hurts the teachers, but it hurts our students in the process. So it's not just some cute little political game that's happening. It's foundationally harming our communities. And many times it means our low income and minoritized communities in the process. And unfortunately, again, the more that you weaken public education, the more that you can bring in vouchers for private schools that really only subsidize wealthy people to be able to go off and get an education that they should be paying for already. We have a tendency to focus on a lot of regressive educational reforms in our state, and we're not unique in that space. But I'm very upset about it, because again, it doesn't really matter whether you're talking about educational justice, like that our students should be able to get a quality education regardless of their race or socioeconomic status, or if we think about the state as a whole, that we're going more increasingly into a knowledge-based economy and we need an educated populace to do it. No matter what your rationale is, we need our kids to be educated, and these kind of political games don't do anything except to harm our students in the process. And at the end of the day, I think it's really important to remember that we're not talking about critical race theory. The foundation of what we're talking about here is censorship. You're taking a specific idea and saying, no, you cannot talk about this in class. You cannot introduce this idea in class. And there's a certain irony coming from the right when they proclaim to be the people who are advancing freedom and freedom for all. They're the freedom party. We want freedom, individual freedom. Well, where's the freedom of the choice of the instructor to be able to use these? We don't allow freedom when it comes to other people. I want my freedom, but you don't get your freedom. I want my freedom to not be exposed to critical race theory, but I do not trust you as a teacher with this in your hand. And unfortunately, that is a complete inversion of what's happening. This is antithetical to freedom. It is censorship, pure and simple. We've been down this road before. We're going through another racial Groundhog Day where you wake up the same day over and over and over again. But the reason why I continually do work like this is because we don't have to continue to make the same mistakes over and over and over again. We have the opportunity to fight these, but what it also requires is people who don't understand. You don't have to embrace critical race theory, and unless you really understand it, I wouldn't advise you to. But what you can say is that these attacks are predicated on censorship, and that is a foundationally anti-democratic. It is a foundationally anti-American ideal. And if we're really trying to stand up for what democracy should be, we also concurrently have to stand up against censorship, and that's precisely what this is. So that's 21 minutes. All right, I was 1 minute over. That's my in a nutshell summary of critical race theory, and now we have roughly 30, 32 minutes, because I know that a lot of people have a lot of questions, and I just want to make sure we have time for folks to go in different directions. But I really appreciate your time and your attention and welcome me into the space. And now the floor is yours to direct the conversation as you see fit.
Good morning, Dr. Cabrera. You know what I found fascinating is that at a couple of weeks ago at my parish, which will go nameless, an article by, I know you know who she is, Bari Weissman, wrote an article in the New York Times on the day that Hamas attacked those kibbutz in Israel, and basically wrote a strong article that all of DEI programs need to be eliminated. It's false equivalence, it's right-wing extremism. What I found so distressing is that this article was being passed at my mass. And I have not been able to get my parish to respond to me by email or by phone to just explain to me what was the intent, because 90% of those parishioners have no idea what she is and what she represents. So any thoughts for a practical solution for this?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head that, again, this relies on a lack of context, which is part of the ignorance which allows people to pick this up. And if it's one of these things that, it's being passed out, at your parish, why not have a quick one pager explaining who this person is, how they have a political axe to grind, how they are really rigidly a right-wing ideologue that really doesn't have minoritized communities or low-income communities at heart. And I think it's really important to be able to have sort of that counter narrative to that space and be able to really accurately define it, because again, it's one of those things that we're these there's something not just about a decontextualized issue, but also having it validated by the New York Times that people, okay, it should have some merit if it's in the New York Times right now. Maybe I agree and disagree, but fundamentally at the end of the day, I think that it's critically important to sort of re-educate along those lines, give people the real facts about who this person is, and that would allow at least for a little bit more complex thinking about why they would be so opposed to DEI efforts. Because usually once you dig just a little bit beneath the surface, you start getting to, oh my gosh, I really, why would I be agreeing with this person? They have such a radical viewpoint of that this is, about the way that this nation should be. And in many respects, that's what we continually have to do. I mean, the irony is that, as I said, the underlying irony here is that the forces that be who are attacking DEI efforts largely are continually saying that DEI is anti-American, yet they're advocating a form of censorship, and nothing could be more un-American than that.
And real quickly, Doctor, just explain to everybody what DEI. I don't like acronyms, but
I'm sorry. Yes, yes, I appreciate that. DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's very popular within institutions of higher education. Diversity being more along the lines of you have a numerical representation, you have lots of people from different backgrounds coming together. Equity being that the unique needs of each group are being met in their very specific way. So undocumented students just trying to navigate financial aid have very unique issues that are specific to them that say undocumented students don't. And so it's tending to that and trying to make sure that just where somebody comes from is not a complete determinant of where they're going to go. And that inclusion starts from the perspective that our institutions were exclusive for as their foundational at their foundation, and we need to figure out how to adapt to again meet the needs of the students who are coming in and how they're experiencing life, whether it's through debt, whether it's through range of identities that are coming up, whether it is through I mean there's a number of different things that we never had to consider back when University of Arizona was first founded. So DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then trying to have them go all the way together. I do like it sometimes where people will add a J to it for justice, but that's just because JEDI makes Jedi, and I'm a Star Wars nerd. So,
all right, I have a question in the chat.
sure.
Ellen Parrish asks you to solve all the world's problems. She says, the post-truth era we're living in, what are your suggestions for dealing with this phenomenon of post-truthiness?
Absolutely. Okay. So I well, there's a couple of things going on here. I want to start off for what I don't want to do. And I know this is a horrible way of framing the issue because if I tell you what not to do psychologically, it's in your head. Don't think of a pink elephant. You're going to think of a pink elephant. But just work with me on this one and just bear with me. There is an inclination to try to combat propaganda with more propaganda. Basically propagate, oh well, their propaganda is evil, so we have to do our propaganda. And I absolutely do not support that in any way, shape, or form. I don't think, that's that for me, that's kind of that idea of fighting fire with fire. And we throw that around as a colloquialism all the time, and we forget, wow, I'm gonna fight fire with fire. I just burned the whole house down. No, you fight fire with water. And the water to this fire of post-truth is twofold. And Noam Chomsky said it really clearly, even back in the 60s. The responsibility of the intellectual is to pursue truth and to expose lies. And that same paradigm rings true here. And that requires us to pursue truth, which is the foundation of the academic endeavors that I have or that I engage in. But number two, it's incredibly important to expose why these are lies, why that this whole idea of that DEI and is this radical approach. I know radical folks, and you know what radical folks don't like? They don't like DEI stuff because it's too tepid an approach to what they want. They want a radical restructuring of society. DEI folks do not do that. And unfortunately, a lot of this is necessary, and we're not nearly as well organized at getting the message out there. But unfortunately, that's what we need to do. We need to be able to do those two things. It's an incredibly complicated where the rubber hits the road. But if we can maintain a focus on pursuing truth and exposing lies, that's the foundation of the work that we have to do. But again, it can't slip into propaganda because that is never, it's one of those things, it's that slippery little slope. Well, I'm just going to fudge it a little bit here, I'm going to fudge it a little bit here. And the more that we do that, you slip into propaganda, you slip away from truth, you lose your grip on truth. And that is incredibly dangerous. So we have to stay rooted, even though it feels like we need a certain discipline that the other side will not have. And that's going to be really, really important moving ahead. So I see that there's one in the chat that says, given a major purpose of education is to get young adults to think for themselves, should they also know what critical race, what CRT actually is, so they can have their own opinion of it? The short answer of it is absolutely. And I'll be I'll be 100% upfront with y'all. I teach critical race theory at the university. I've published using critical race theory as a framework before. And in the field of higher education, I have also written a foundational piece that is critical of critical race theory. Now, I don't want to get into all of the nuances about why, what my specific criticism is. We get too much in the weeds on that. But the point being that, yes, I don't want anybody to accept ideas at face value. I don't want them to just say, oh, well, critical race theory is the truth. No, critical race theory is an approach to obtaining truth. It is an approach to pursuing truth. And you know what? There are other race-based analyses that I also use on a very frequent basis. Because if I become rigidly dogmatic that this is the way, you necessarily remove yourself from scientific and social scientific inquiry. You have to maintain an inquisitive view of the world, and not just that I have found truth, ergo, we can't elevate an area of study to a dogma or a religion, because then it ceases to be an area of study. It becomes an article of faith. And I'm not trying to, I mean, faith has its place, but that's not what we're doing here in this space. And so I would love it when folks engage with an open mind and an open heart, and really say, oh, you know what, some of the best pieces that I've ever seen come out of my classes are ones where students were like, I really like this piece. I was struggling here. I didn't really find, and trying to unpack these tensions and again maintain an inquisitive approach to this and not just be rigidly dogmatic. Because if you become dogmatic, again, it becomes an article of faith, and that's antithetical to social scientific pursuit of the truth.
I'm interested in the concept of whiteness. One of your areas of speciality is whiteness. Can we
Yes,
talk about that a little bit? What exactly do you mean by whiteness? And
absolutely.
how does that impact our politics in general, the
Mhm.
idea of whiteness?
Absolutely. So, what's fascinating when you look historically is that people who would later become white are they didn't they were primarily known from their specific country of origin. So you had mass immigration of Italians, Poles, Jews, Germans. You name the ethnic European group, and you had a lot of or cross-ethnic tension, but there was always a certain ideological orientation of general European superiority, which allowed for the concurrent enslavement of Africans as well as the theft of indigenous lands. But it wasn't a really cohesive, unifying thought. Again, people were more tied to their ethnic background in that area. There was really a tipping point in the 1700s around Bacon's Rebellion, where the governor of Virginia said, no more westward expansion, stay here. And a group of low-income Europeans and freed slaves came together and said, no, we're going to go steal indigenous lands regardless of what you say. And they did the westward expansion because they had power in numbers, and they were able to pursue that in some very, very meaningful ways. By the way, Maria, don't let me forget, put a pin in cast, because I need to make a big caveat off of that book. Let me come back to the regularly scheduled program. The As that happened, though, the ruling elites in colonial Americas realized they could not maintain control. They didn't have the numbers or societal control if there were these cross ethnic coalitions. And so what they did is they gave people who would become white sort of, forgive the bad pun, skin in the game. And they would say, you're white, which means you're superior to all other people in the world, that everyone else is sort of a lesser than human, a more of an infantile people's, not really ready for self-rule. You are, but everyone else is not. And the eminent sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, when he analyzed Reconstruction, called this the psychological and public wages of whiteness. That is, I may be downtrodden, I may be struggling, but at least I'm not black. At least I'm not indigenous. I'm still a person, and I have the potential to fulfill that. And really, what happened is there was really two ways that people became white, and they had to work concurrently. One, you had to believe in the superiority of your race. And number two, that you had to sort of give up through an assimilative process your ethnic culture. And so, and you can see how well that assimilation happened. If you just as a little thought experiment, if you ask, say, people in a Chicano community, like, what's great about being Chicano? Well, it's like, well, I got to put another hole in my belt because it's tamale season, and I'm going to put on some weight. There's posadas and the Virgen and all this, it's Christmas time. I mean, there's all these, there's a culture, there's a ties that bind. If I ask people on the white side of my family, what's great about being German or Pennsylvania Dutch? Once we get past, say, like Oktoberfest, which no one really, it's trivia. And you see how how that assimilation happens so perfectly, that loss of culture becomes that assimilation into whiteness. Now, how does that affect things nowadays? Well, a couple of reasons. One, if you have been able to personally succeed without having these cultural roots, which are so foundational to so many minoritized communities, it's easy to attack DEI because you're like, I succeeded without this. Why do you have to know your history so much? And then it also overlooks a lot of how this creation of whiteness, which it's more of an ideological construct, is it's distinct from white people, but it has this. It definitely is enforced by white people having white privilege in that process, and it's a situation where it foundationally is sort of a social norm against which all other racially minoritized groups are judged. And it becomes very, especially in a post-civil rights era, it used to be in the, from the early 20th century back to Bacon's Rebellion, we were, it was whiteness was a marker of inherent superiority.
Mhm.
Once a lot of those ideological constructs overtly were undermined with the activism of the 1960s, a lot of the racism got driven underground. It really, what happened was that whiteness became a social norm. It still reified a structure of racial domination, privilege, oppression, etc. But it wasn't as overtly done. And so because you had several hundred years of structuring white privilege into society, I mean, you even had it in the law where people, if they were white but were classified as a person of color, they have actually sued for defamation because their livelihood was reduced, their reputation was sullied by being labeled non-white, and the opposite has not happened. And so we're having to contend with several hundred years of construction in that way. And we're slowly but surely being able to grapple with it on some meaningful ways, but we're long, long ways from it being foundational. All right.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned caste, the book. How does the idea of whiteness jive with or rhyme with class or caste?
Caste. Okay. So I'm gonna give a quick review of the book, and it's gonna be this is like, it's beautiful and be careful.
Yeah.
The histories that Wilkerson recovers, just in painful detail, are so critically important that we remember and don't shy away from and lean into as much as we possibly can. And she is an absolutely brilliant writer. Because it's one of these things, like I wish I had 1/10 of her writing ability, because the way that she can just make this on the page just come alive, and then it hits you not only in an intellectual way but in this visceral way, that it's not just, oh, racism and white supremacy. It's like you see the harm that is incurred, and for that, incredible book. The problem is she's not a social scientist. And so the whole thesis around caste, that's been debunked for like the last 60 years. It doesn't, she went to India and had this aha moment, but didn't really look deeply at what a caste meant. And also, one of the bigger difficulties is that, and there is a pragmatic issue here, is that, she says, oh, well, there's a caste where, whiteness is on top, and there's these gradations that go all the way down to blackness at the bottom. And this is, and I have to be really careful here. What she's arguing for is a comparative analysis. That is, that basically being black is materially worse than, say, being indigenous. And unfortunately, all of the examples that she gave in the book are against black folk. And so and then if we flip the script and we look at the construction of whiteness, the paradigm was about who is white and who is not white. And that's the core contradiction that we're dealing with, not some gradation. That's why we had this one drop rule. And that's why, and the problem is that in order for her to make her case substantively, she would have to say that, say, the attempted genocide of indigenous Americans and the theft of their land is in some way less horrific than that's what happened in chattel slavery. And for me, none of this makes sense. I don't want to have to rank Japanese internment, manifest destiny, like, you just go down the racial horrors that were engaged in our country. I don't want to have to rank them, and I don't think that we should. And so so it's foundationally flawed as a piece of social science, because it just doesn't reflect that we live in a caste system. We do live, and I mean, Oliver Cox debunked that in, like, I think it was like 1953 as a sociologist. But again, I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I am so glad that I read that book, I am so glad that some of these instances of racism I remember from my other studies. Some of them I didn't know before, but it really gives you a great sense of how ingrained racism was and still is, the legacy that we're living out in this contemporary age. But don't, please think critically about the thesis of that we live in this caste, because really what that can do problematically is that it can start pitting people against each other, where, well, who's the most oppressed? And Angela Davis and Betita Martinez had that as a conversation way back in like 93, 94. And they came to the conclusion, and they recycle it now, saying that whenever you play the oppression Olympics, who is more oppressed? Is it harder to be a woman or to be gay? Is it harder to be black or brown? Is it hard? If you try to play the oppression Olympics, we've already lost. The second that you open up that dialogue, it is absolutely, we've lost the discussion already.
I see a question in the chat from Steve Mizell. Do you want to respond to that, Professor?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's I would highly. It's one of these things that I would highly suggest that Steve actually, um, uh, you know, go back to Derek Bell's thesis. I offered Bell's thesis about interest convergence regarding Brown versus the Board of Education, and he had directly addressed it and provided evidence as to why he said that it wasn't decided on moral grounds, in terms of the moral grounds of supporting all the harm of all children. He demonstrated how the harm that was being incurred by white children gained primacy in the ruling. And so I would say, I guess I look at the framing of this, that there's already this DEI woke approach that's in scare quotes in the question. And I've offered what is a legal analysis, reinterpretation of a case, and I never said anything about devious whites, or I never, and so I'd ask Steve, if you really want to explore this, number one, just read the thesis before
And the
attacking it.
opinion.
And yeah, and read the opinion and the thesis together, and then also, it's almost like this obviously seems in response to something that I said, and I didn't say anything about devious white people. And so if that's something that you're interpreting, I'd say please, also take a look in the mirror with yourself, and why are you hearing something that wasn't there? Because and this is why I also say that the barrage of DEI woke, it creates boogeyman where there isn't one, and we start to hear things that aren't actually there. And the classic example of a sort of who people call a 90s liberal is Bill Maher, and every week he's back there again. The woke left, the woke left, the woke left. It's all in universities, it's all in these campuses, and it's a caricature. It doesn't have a basis in reality, but it's one of these ones that we have to grapple with it because people really believe it. And Steve has his hand up. We'll join in the conversation.
Well, as long as you mention that, Bill Maher, Chris Rock, Dave Chappelle, Sam Harris, there are many people that will not go on a college campus today because they are talked down. They don't get a chance to do what they do. You're laughing and smiling. I guess I'm coming off of having seen the 3 presidents of universities being asked a very simple question. And I've read enough to know that, I'm an old school liberal. I'm not a right-wing Republican, but I have a problem when you talk about censorship, but there seems to be censorship on the left. I don't want to see any censorship,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And I don't like what I see happening. And I tend to think that if the question, and I don't like Stefanik from the get-go. I think she's disingenuous, dishonest, a liar. There's nothing about her I like. But the question she asked was a very simple question. And I happen to believe that it was asked of a different group, that maybe the response would have been different. And the other thing is, I've read enough about where there's this sort of snowflake attitude. I don't know how far I got in the
Yeah, about
conversation.
5 seconds ago. So just
Yeah, I'm told that words of violence on the left, oh, you hurt me, you said a word that's triggering me. But when there's a threat of real violence and nothing is done, then it gets people to stand up and say, what's going on? So, yes, Bill Maher, on every Friday night of this show, talks about the far left. And it's not just him, but other people. And somebody mentioned Barry Weiss, who I think is very right wing. But I read the article as well. And I think there has to be some reckoning, because I don't think either side is perfect. And I think that on the left, there is a tendency to shout down opinions that you don't like. And if you want free speech, it's got to be free speech on both sides. And there's a lot of the speech on the right that I detest, but there's got to be free speech on both sides. And I'll leave it at that.
thanks, Steve.
Oh, I appreciate what you're saying, and I one of the things that I'm latching on to there, and is that, you said I've read a lot, and but these folks, Bill Maher, Chris Rock, these old school comedians, they have a vested interest in just it not evolving and changing and adapting, and so they adopt this caricature of what higher education is. I do agree that there are elements on institutions of higher education on the left that there does need to be a reckoning with, in terms of that there are people on the left who don't value free speech. I think it's wildly exaggerated. I think it's and this is somebody who, and I mean, I work with these students on a regular basis, and unfortunately, a loud couple becomes representative of the whole. Like, we have something like 53,000 students at the University of Arizona, and unfortunately, a couple of loud ones become representative of the entire group. And it's not to say that we shouldn't be having this, but there's no moral equivalence between the left and the right on these in terms of censorship, because you have, if we look at it structurally, you have a couple of loud students that shout down a speaker, which is dramatically different than creating a state or federal law banning an area of thought.
Yeah.
And so I disagree with the categorization on some very foundational levels. And that's why I keep wanting to challenge. That's why I keep saying that I love and embrace my slightly left of center folk. But even Bill Maher, if you look, he caters so much to right-wing folk. He has on his program, like Bill Barr and all these folks who are coming out of the Trump administration. He does not have true leftists anymore on his show. And so everything that's said is a caricature of the left and a gross homogenization of the left, as opposed to an accurate representation. And if we're having an accurate representation, I'm all for it, because again, I want to be a truth teller. I have to be in this space where I acknowledge there are some areas that we really do need to work on in terms of free speech. And it is wildly exaggerated, wildly exaggerated. And it's one of those things that what's funny is that, for me, is that, when you had Bill Maher and Chris Rock coming up in the mid 90s, that was also a time where people like Richard Pryor were not becoming as palatable anymore, because there's a consistent evolution as we go through this stuff. And so it's not saying that You know, that this whole idea, we've recycled this idea before. The mid 90s was all about political correctness. And as a matter of fact, Bill Maher's first program on ABC was called Politically Incorrect.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's so, you know, we need to, you know, we recycle these ideas and act as if that this is a new thing coming up. But this right wing attack on education as a whole, and higher education in particular, has caught on in different ways right now.
Yeah.
But again, it's part of a 30, 40-year-old playbook. And we have to acknowledge that that has to be the starting point, because otherwise it can inadvertently leverage people like the Greater Democrats of Tucson to actually play into the right-wing playbook. And we have to, it's not saying that the left is devoid of criticism. But again, when you have almost like a 50-50 split on Bill Maher's show that says, oh, the woke left and, you know, the you know, the don't say gay law in Florida, this is, it's like, come on, like there's no comparison between the two, and we have to reconcile with that and be very honest about the proportionality. And it's not to overlook one and say it's only here, but really foundationally that's sort of where it comes down to. And we're exactly at 2 o'clock.
Yeah, just as you can have a false equivalence, you can have a false disequivalence. And that, I think, this idea that the left wing is somehow more censorious than the right wing is completely off base. If you've ever tried to address a right wing audience and engage them on anything they don't want to hear, you're going to discover the same kind of pushback that you would get on a college campus if you're trying to, you know, do a minstrel show, as it were. So thank you, Dr. Cabrera, for joining us today. I appreciate your time and your instruction. And it was very, very helpful illumination of the issues around race and critical theory. So I appreciate your time, and thank you very much for coming. I want to thank everybody else for coming today and joining us here at DGT. For those of us who joined us for the election, thank you so much. And I'm going to close out the meeting for everybody now. Have a great afternoon. Bye, everybody.